Of everyone that had a major problem with Darth Sidious's empire, one may surprise you, and we believe that Darth Bane would have absolutely hated what Sidious did, the culmination of the Rule of Two, and in today's holocron, we'll explain why. The Galactic Empire was, for all intents and purposes, the ultimate goal of the Sith Order and the Rule of Two. For thousands of years, the Sith had been trying to close their grip around the galaxy and establish their supremacy. The Rule of Two was the final plan to make this actually happen, and it was the only Sith plot that actually succeeded in its entirety. Due to the growing power and the change of the Sith, along with Palpatine's political cunning, the Republic itself became the foundation of what would become a new Sith Empire. However, this new regime would only last 20 years, and was ultimately a massive failure. We've talked before about why Palpatine himself was pretty underwhelmed by his own creation in the Empire, but in today's holocron, we want to go over why we think Bane himself would have hated the culmination of the Rule of Two and what the Sith became. Bane might even say that Palpatine had built an utter disgrace. But before we jump into the holocron, we wanted to remind you that the Rule of Two was partially successful because of all of the knowledge they had of the past. If you wish to possess this same knowledge, then be sure to force crush that subscribe button and join our archives today. Now, onto the video. The most glaring issue with Sidious's empire was that he inadvertently repeats the same mistakes of the old Sith. The foundational reason behind the Rule of Two was to turn the Sith infighting that made their order weak into something that would ultimately make them stronger. In the old days, the empires were drastically weakened by squabbling, which pit the Sith against themselves and their underlings. Along with this, selfishness and arrogance abounded, accompanied by the ever-present mistakes of the Sith. Their biggest is underestimating their enemy. Sidious notoriously did not take the Rebel Alliance seriously at all. He called them weak and pitiful, which may or may not have been true, but he underestimated just how heavy-handed oppression would drive the people to desperation. A few insurgencies here and there were easily crushed by the might of the Empire, but when the rebel factions grouped together to form the Alliance to restore the Republic, Palpatine did not respond with enough force. This hope-fueled dream was a Jedi magnet. Vader and Thrawn were the only two people in the Empire who actually saw the rebellion as a genuine threat worthy of their full attention. And by the way, we believe that Thrawn is pivotal in this story. Thrawn was the one who was at the receiving end of a great many of the Empire's weaknesses and faults during his career. And among the Empire, Thrawn took the rebels the most seriously. Bane may have thought himself much better than his enemies, but he rarely underestimated them. The only time Bane allowed his arrogance to blind him was when he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the man, or men, had absolutely no chance of defeating him. Palpatine felt this way about the rebellion, but he didn't analyze every angle of the situation like Bane would have. Palpatine relied heavily on his powers of foresight, and using his influence to manipulate events according to his plan. This was an excellent stroke of genius on Palpatine's part, which Bane would approve of. But what Palpatine was wrong was to believe that his victory over the rebellion was absolute from the start. They may have started out as a remnant of the delegation of the 2000, but soon many other systems began supporting the rebellion openly because of Palpatine's prejudice, which brings us to our next issue. A massive problem with the Empire was its anti-alien sentiment. The society was very human-centric, with species racism running rampant, especially in the upper echelon of the elites. This ultimately severely damaged the Empire, because alien species had a lot to offer. Instead of oppressing them, Palpatine should have respected them for their benefits and what they could have offered his empire. Bane himself had no problem with non-humans. In fact, he was primarily trained by one. Lord Qasim was a Twi'lek who secretly tutored Bane during his formative years at the Academy of Korriban. When all other teachers had given up on the young Bane, Qasim was the only one who believed in him enough to train him into the powerhouse that he would become. Bane saw past the appearances of others, and literally only looked at how useful they were, which is why he was ready to take the Iktachi Darth Cognis as his new student, as Bane believed that his human apprentice Zana was a failure, and he actively looked for alien species to tutor. Palpatine's oppression of the non-humans was a propaganda strategy that was meant to keep the citizens in line. They were meant to direct their anger and their oppression towards the alien neighbors. While darkly genius on paper, this ultimately hurt the Imperial machine a great deal in the long run, as all the non-humans flocked to join the rebellion in droves. But this is only a symptom of a much larger issue, one of the biggest in Sidious's empire, the rampant elitism. This is where we step into a major portion of the problem with the Empire, and what Bane would have called a disgrace. The Imperial Navy, specifically the Grand Moffs, Moffs, and Admirals, were a gigantic problem. Sidious did not structure his Imperial High Command efficiently at all. Instead of promoting men based on skill, aptitude, and cunning, such as Thrawn, he allowed elitism to take precedence. The rich and the influential members were the ones buying their way to the top through credits, reputation, or favor. The Empire was built on status, not skill. This ultimately impacted the collective capability of those in charge, since they hadn't gotten there through actual skill, but through prestige. Thrawn watched in the early days of his career as the power-hungry and important men got their way into command based on prestige alone. This meant sabotaging one another. More capable officers who stood in their way would be discarded, and Sidious actually encouraged this infighting amongst his Grand Moffs in order to keep them competitive and distracted. Again, on paper, this was to ensure that they didn't rise up against him, but it ultimately made the Empire weaker instead of stronger. Sidious would even complain about the insufferable incompetence of his officers, and had to stop Vader from killing all of them simply out of sheer annoyance. But not only was this bad for the Empire's image of invincibility, but it severely damaged the Moffs and the Admiral's ability to work with one another. These men were not Sith. They cannot feel the Force or use the dark side to grow stronger from strife. All the infighting did was weaken them, and make the entire Navy suffer as a result. Since they couldn't trust each other, and every man was after his own reputation and glory, this caused mass dissension. Take for instance the Battle of Atollon and Rebels. Thrawn had the rebellion pinned down on Atollon and was engaging them above the planet to keep them from escaping. In order for Ezra to make it out alive, the rebel Admiral Sato decided to make a sacrificial run at the Empire's formation in order to create an opening. Thrawn strictly instructed all the ships to hold their positions, but Admiral Constantine directly disobeyed this order from a superior and broke formation to intercept the Admiral, blatantly admitting to doing so for personal glory. Luckily though, his foolishness didn't completely compromise the mission, but it did allow Ezra Bridger to escape, and it did cost Constantine his life. Grand Admiral Thrawn's ascent to the top was riddled with difficulty, not just because of his race, but because of the politics and the bureaucracy of the Imperials. His efforts to actually make real change to the Empire was always hampered by this. In several instances, he was put under the service of a greedy, insecure commanding officer, someone who tried to take credit for Thrawn's work. Darth Bane, on the other hand, taught to always use what is useful and discard what was not. Sidious should have cleaned house among his high command a long time ago. Only Tarkin and others were worthy of the Grand Moff position, but even their heads would eventually get too big and become dangerous. This leads us into our next problem. The Empire held way too much power, specifically the Moffs. Sidious allowed the Grand Moffs to have more control than even the Lords of the Sith did back in the day. In the old era, a Sith Lord would definitely have his own ship, but only Darth or men of the Dark Council were allowed to have their own fleet. Grand Moffs had several fleets in their possession and command, and even presided over entire sectors of space, with countless star systems under their direct jurisdiction. Things would only get worse with the Death Star. Sidious was extremely hands-off, and he should have been calling the shots personally. I mean so personally that his throne at the Imperial Palace should have been a comm system directly to the engineer room of the Death Star. Palpatine would right these wrongs with the second Death Star, but there likely would have been no need for a second one had Sidious not been so hands-off. He gave Tarkin the controls of the battle station, and only had Vader as an overseer, which put him in a subservient position to Tarkin while on the station. Bane would have found this to be inexcusable. These men were given the keys to something that they didn't earn or understand, and they became so drunk with power that they disrespected a Lord of the Sith to his face. Vader was under the impression that the power had literally made them lose their minds, and canonically speaking, Tarkin did actually lose his sanity after possessing this power. But breaking away from the high command of the Empire, and moving on to our last point, all of this is to only point to the glaring problem with Sidious's empire that Bane would have mentioned first, his disregard for the rule of two. Bane's philosophy was to be the religion of the Sith Order, followed only second to the dark side. We know from when Darth Krayt spoke to Bane's holocron that Bane intended for the rule of two to be a permanent thing. Many believe it was supposed to end once the Sith finally achieved domination, but this was not true. The rule of two was supposed to remain so that the Sith remained in a state of evolution. Their progress was supposed to accelerate to the point where they were so advanced that no one would ever challenge the Dark Lord again, except for their own apprentice. Theoretically, once the Sith finally got the Empire that they wanted, Bane would have desired for the Sith Master to relinquish their mantle as Emperor once the apprentice took over, and so on and so forth. Yes, that would mean that the throne of the Emperor would be a revolving door, but this would ensure that the Sith would not only evolve, but that the Empire would as well. With a new Emperor brings new reforms, new policies, and new perspectives to mend the cracks of the old Empire. Sidious, in his megalomania, threw away the rule of two in favor for what he called the rule of one, establishing himself as the eternal Emperor. Bane would have hated this idea and would have called it weak and selfish, but not selfish in a good way, selfish in a way that destroyed and weakened the Sith. Whether or not Vader would have made for a good Emperor is kind of out of the question. The important thing is that had the cycle continued, we may have seen the Sith Order evolve beyond even Darth Vader's power, because he would have had to train an apprentice that could supersede his own. If they had followed the rule of two as Bane had established, something like Emperor Galen Marek or Starkiller could have been a reality. Or perhaps Luke Skywalker would have sat upon the throne of the Sith, becoming untouchable from that moment on. This was Bane's vision. This was ultimate power. Not for one Sith to hold the power forever, but for the Sith to evolve. But Sidious poisoned this. He made his empire far more selfish than Bane had intended. To Bane, there was nothing greater than power, and nothing greater than the Sith. And if he had to die to further that, he would. Sidious, on the other hand, clutched to life, clutched to his own power, his words ringing true. All those that have power fear to lose it. Darth Bane established a philosophy that would last 1,000 years and would only pay off with 24 years of actual rulership over the galaxy. That is barely 2% return on time investment by the Sith. Of course, if you want to include all of the Legends history as attributing to Sidious's rise, then the return would even be less. Of course, that's just Legends though. Lucas amended this fact in canon by explicitly stating that at one point over 1,000 years before the Empire, that the Sith had actually ruled the galaxy. The canon history of the Old Republic is really unclear as of right now, as it hasn't been fully explored, but we do know that originally, the Old Republic looked very different. The Sith were in absolute power here, with the Jedi rising up to overthrow them. But of course, any way that you look at it, in canon, Sidious's rise was a failure in the end. He would even return in both continuities a second time, the Dark Empire in Legends and the Sith Eternal in canon, only to fail again. I think the biggest thing that gets in Palpatine's way is himself. He can't imagine a galaxy, an empire, or a Sith without him, and this would prove to be his biggest weakness. Bane could imagine a future without him, and because of that, he sacrificed and established the rule of two. But what are your thoughts on this, my friends, and the philosophies of Darth Sidious and Darth Bane? And do you agree that Bane would have been extremely upset with how the Sith turned out? As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching the channel, and as always, may the Force be with you.